The crowd stood in complete silence as the condemned men were led to the gallows. Their faces were pale, their uniforms stripped of medals and pride. The air was thick with winter cold and heavy emotion. A priest whispered last rites as soldiers prepared the ropes. Cameras clicked. Onlookers watched history unfold. The long-awaited execution of Nazi officers found guilty of killing 1,700 innocent Poles. Justice, decades late, was finally here. But as the final command echoed, "Proceed," one of the officers turned to the crowd with a chilling smirk. What he whispered next left everyone frozen in disbelief. The story of how those men reached this moment began years earlier, in the ruins of post-war Europe. Poland had been scarred deeply by Nazi occupation. Towns burned, families wiped out, entire communities erased. Among the worst atrocities was the massacre in a small Polish village, where 1,700 civilians, including children and the elderly, were executed in cold blood. When the war ended, survivors returned to empty homes, mass graves, and unanswered questions. For a while, it seemed the killers had vanished into history's shadows. But the truth has a way of surfacing, sometimes when the world least expects it. In 1946, Polish investigators working with Allied forces uncovered a diary belonging to one of the German officers stationed near the massacre site. It contained coordinates, orders, and names, evidence that linked several high-ranking Nazi officials directly to the killings. The investigation widened quickly. Witnesses came forward, including villagers who had been forced to dig the graves. Their testimonies painted a horrifying picture of what happened that day. The victims had been gathered under false promises of relocation. Instead, they were surrounded by soldiers, forced to kneel, and executed in groups. The world had underestimated the scale of their. As evidence grew, international prosecutors prepared for trial. The Nuremberg proceedings had already exposed the depths of Nazi crimes, but this case was different. It was personal for Poland. Families of the victims filled courtrooms, clutching photos of lost loved ones. The accused sat behind glass walls, silent, as witnesses recounted the unspeakable. One survivor, a woman in her 70s, described hiding in a ditch as her husband and sons were shot. Her voice shook, but she spoke every word with courage. "They thought no one would remember," she said. "But we are here to tell the world." The defendants claimed they were only following orders, that the decisions came from above. But documents told another story. Signatures matched, names appeared on execution lists. Each piece of evidence tied them closer to the massacre. For weeks, the courtroom was filled with maps, coded telegrams, and photographs of the site, gruesome reminders of how organized evil can be. The lead prosecutor called it an operation not of war, but of extermination. When the verdict was finally read, the room erupted in tears, some of grief, others of relief. Every guilty sentence was a step toward justice for the dead. But justice did not come quietly. Outside the courthouse, protests erupted. Some argued the executions were too harsh, while others demanded more names be added to the list. Governments debated diplomacy while survivors demanded closure. The condemned men, meanwhile, maintained their innocence. "History will judge differently," one officer wrote in a final letter, claiming he was a scapegoat. Yet the truth was undeniable. Their signatures, their orders, their victims. As the days counted down to their execution, reporters from around the world arrived to witness what many called the end of an era of silence. On the morning of the execution, gray clouds hung over the compound. Prison guards stood in formation. Each of the condemned was given a final meal, though most left it untouched. Some prayed. Others stared blankly at the wall. Outside, Polish citizens gathered, not out of vengeance, but to witness justice. For years, they had lived with grief that had no closure. Now, for the first time, they would see accountability. Families of the victims held candles and photos, whispering names that had once been silenced. For them, this wasn't revenge. The execution site was surrounded by barbed wire and guarded heavily. Only journalists, officials, and select witnesses were allowed inside. Each officer was brought forward one at a time, their crimes read aloud. The air was still except for the sound of boots on gravel. When the trapdoor opened, a collective gasp filled the courtyard. Some turned away, others wept quietly. It was a moment that mixed sorrow and relief. The atrocities could never be undone, But the message was clear. The world had not forgotten. Evil, no matter how long it hides, would face its reckoning. As the executions ended, the crowd outside began to sing softly, a hymn that echoed through the cold morning air. The sound carried far beyond the prison walls, reaching the village where the massacre had taken place years before. There, new flowers were laid at the graves of the 1,700 souls. For the first time in decades, the site was peaceful. Yet, even as the world declared justice served, whispers began among investigators. Some names from the diary had never been found. A few officers had escaped Europe, vanishing with new identities. Could they still be alive? That question hung heavy in the air as the final report was filed. The executions marked an end, but not the end. For every officer punished, another might still be free. Years later, when an anonymous letter arrived in Warsaw claiming to hold the location of one who got away, investigators reopened the case. What they uncovered next would shock the world once again. One of the masterminds behind the massacre was not dead at all. He had been living under a false name, hidden in plain sight. And his story was far from over. It started with a letter, unsigned, written in shaky handwriting, sent to the Polish War Crimes Office in Warsaw. The writer claimed to know the location of a man who had led the massacre in 1943. At first, officials dismissed it. Many false tips had come before. But then, the letter mentioned something only the true mastermind could have known: the name of the small stream that ran behind the killing site. Investigators froze. That detail had never been made public. They reopened the case immediately. Somewhere, one of the men responsible for 1,700 deaths, the letter led to a quiet town in Argentina. Decades after the war, many former Nazis had fled there under false identities. With help from international agents, Polish authorities began a secret mission. They traced a man named Karl Neumann, a factory manager who had arrived in Buenos Aires in 1948. His papers were clean, his life quiet. But one photograph, sent from the letter's author, changed everything. The man's face, though older, matched perfectly with a missing officer from the massacre, Otto Weiss. He had been declared dead years ago. Now, two Polish investigators, Captain Marek Lewandowski and Officer Daniel Karpinski, were sent to Argentina under diplomatic cover. Their task was clear, but dangerous: confirm Weiss's identity and bring evidence strong enough for extradition. They watched him from a distance, an old man tending his garden, greeting neighbors, living peacefully. It was hard to believe this quiet figure had once commanded a massacre. But when they saw him polish an old military badge in his study late one night, all doubts vanished. Weiss wasn't just hiding. He was proud. He had escaped justice and believed the world. The investigators knew they needed proof. They broke into an abandoned office once used by Weiss's company and searched the records. There, hidden inside a desk drawer, they found documents stamped with his real name and an original Nazi ID photo. It was undeniable. Weiss had built a new life using forged papers, bribing officials to erase his past. As Marek held the ID in his hands, he whispered, "We finally found him." But they couldn't arrest him yet. Argentina's laws made extradition difficult. They needed to prove that Weiss was still wanted for crimes against humanity. Days turned into weeks. Marek and Daniel gathered witness statements, secretly contacting survivors now living abroad. They located a woman named Helena, who had been only 10 years old during the massacre. When shown Weiss's photo, her eyes filled with tears. "That's him," she whispered. "He gave the orders. He watched." Her testimony, combined with the evidence, built a case that could not be denied. But before they could act, word leaked. Someone inside the embassy had tipped Weiss off. When agents arrived at his home the next morning, Weiss had vanished into the countryside, leaving behind only burned documents and an empty house. Interpol joined the search, spreading his photo across borders. He was old now, but cunning. Investigators learned he had contacts who helped him hide in exchange for money and silence. Meanwhile, the story broke across international newspapers. Nazi war criminal believed alive in South America. Crowds protested, demanding justice. The ghosts of history had returned, and the world was watching again. For Marek and Daniel, it became personal. "He took everything from those families," Daniel said. "We can't let him die." Months later, a break came from an unlikely source. A taxi driver in Paraguay reported an elderly man matching Weiss's description crossing the border with forged papers. The Polish team coordinated with local police and set up a sting operation. They found him living under the name Eric Bauer, renting a small cabin near the jungle's edge. When officers entered, Weiss didn't resist. He looked up calmly, almost expecting them. "You took your time," he said. "I thought you'd forgotten." His arrest made headlines worldwide. But justice was not yet served. He still had to. The trial, held decades after the original executions, drew massive attention. Cameras filled the courtroom, and survivors traveled from around the world to see the man who had escaped punishment. Weiss, now frail but unrepentant, sat behind glass, expression cold. As survivors testified, he showed no emotion. Helena, now an elderly woman, stood and pointed at him. "You told them to shoot," she said. "I saw you." The room went silent. For a moment, Weiss lowered his head, not in guilt, but exhaustion. When asked if he felt remorse, but history didn't forget. The court found him guilty of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Due to his age, execution was off the table, but the sentence was clear: life imprisonment without parole. Outside the courtroom, reporters asked Helena how she felt. "Justice doesn't erase pain," she said softly, "but it reminds us that truth always finds its way." Weiss was flown back to Europe, where he spent his final years in a high-security facility. The same world he once terrorized now kept him behind bars. The hunter had finally become the prisoner. Years later, when news broke that Otto Weiss had died in custody, few mourned. But one final mystery lingered. Among his belongings, guards found a letter addressed simply, "To the next one." Inside were names, people believed to have helped him escape Europe after the war. Some were long dead, others still alive. The discovery reopened investigations across 3 countries. Justice, it seemed, was not finished. Even after death, Weiss's secrets continued to surface. And somewhere in the world, another name on that list waited for a knock on the door that would change everything. The story of Otto Weiss was not just about one man's escape from justice. It was a symbol of how evil can hide in plain sight, waiting for time to bury the truth. But time did not bury it. Justice, though delayed, found its way back through persistence, memory, and the courage of those who refused to forget. The execution of his fellow officers years earlier had closed one chapter, but Weiss's capture proved another. History has eyes that never truly close. For the survivors, it was never about revenge. It was about remembrance. Stay tuned for Part 3, where we uncover the shocking trail left by Weiss's letter, a new chapter of fugitives, betrayal, and the global hunt for the last living architects of the massacre. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to follow the next part of this investigation.